He told me I'm going on down to Yasgur's farm, gonna join in a rock and roll band. I'm gonna camp out on the land, Lord, I'm gonna try and get my soul free. We are stardust, we are golden, and we got to get ourselves back to the garden. Well, then
Getting
can
ourselves
I
back to
walk
the garden.
beside you? I have come here to
Shabbat Shalom every day. I mean, every day, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Every day is Shabbat. No, it's not really. Only if we lived in the garden would every day be Shabbat, right? So today, I have the immense pleasure, privilege, and honor of teaching with Rabbi David Ingber, who will be along any minute. But before he gets here, that's not him. I just want to tell you that I recently had this incredible dream that we have to get ourselves back to the Garden of Eden. We have to get back to the Garden of Eden. And I was telling my husband about this, and he reminded me of the song by Joni Mitchell, which I kind of knew, but I didn't really know. So I said, well, it's not because I knew that song. It's because we have to get ourselves back to the garden. He goes, no. It's because of Joni Mitchell. So here he is. Here he is, the man of the hour. So today's theme is going to be getting back to the garden. What did we lose when we left the garden? And more specifically, the theme of trust. Right, the theme of trust. And we call this sheet Trust in the Garden. And I realized, because my friend, Rabbi Sharon Konanisfeld, told me, I don't know if she's here, that it's not only the theme of trust in the garden, but it's the command, trust in the garden. So what does that mean? I'm not exactly sure, but we're going to think about all of that and everything. And we're going to start with the bracha over Torah. Okay, Elliot, would you like to recite the bracha?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen, amen. So entering into this sacred space with blessing God and God's blessing of engaging in the eternal words of Torah and soaking in the eternal words of Torah. Okay, we're going to screen share. Anything else you want to say in the beginning?
No,
Rabbi and friend David Ingber.
Oh my goodness. Shechianu v'kiyimanu, to start Reshit again and to be together in another cycle of the never-ending cycle. Like no matter what, we always know that we come back to the beginning, and that's a good thing.
And we were talking the other day, you pointed out something that I never really quite realized, that we go back to the beginning when, at least in the natural cycle in this region, things are dying, right? So it's like birth and death all at once.
All happening all at once. Friends, can you see the sheets that we shared with you? Yes, awesome.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So we're going into Bereshit, and these are texts that are very familiar to many of us and maybe less familiar to some of us. But for those of whom it is very familiar, I invite you to, whatever it means, to approach this with beginner's mind and new eyes. You know, not an easy feat to approach familiar words with kind of an open mind to see new things. So here we go. So what we're looking at today is basically, or at least in the first half, is the quote-unquote sin, transgression, disobedience of Adam and Chava, or Chava really and Adam, of eating from the forbidden tree. What's colloquially referred to as the apple, but if you look closely at the text, you'll see it's not at all an apple, it's the fruit, right? It's the fruit. And the rabbis argue about what that fruit is. And I think apple becomes an apple really in Christian texts because the word for apple in Latin is malum. And someone correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sort of reaching back to some learning from some years ago. And the Christian fathers thought it was an apple because malum has the word mal, or bad in it. So here is just a fruit. That's just an interesting aside. So we're starting in Genesis 2, and it says, in Genesis 2 is the second story of creation, and in Genesis 1, not Adam and Chava, but male and female are created at once, and here they're not created at once, but we're not going to see exactly when they're created. We're just going to dive into a point in the narrative where Adam has already been created, but not yet Chava, right? So this command only comes to Adam, the first Adam or the first human being. Vaikach Adonai Elohim, so we're in 2:15, first source on your page. Vayanichehu began Eden le'ovda u'l'shamra. And God, the Lord, takes Adam and places Adam in the Garden of Eden to work it or worship it, depending on how you translate that word, u'l'shamra, and to guard it, right? And that's very different than where it says elsewhere, I think in Genesis 1, to conquer it, or I forget exactly what the phrasing is right there, but it's very different language in terms of our approach to the earth. Vayitzav Adonai. So here we are, the first command, right? So what's command? That's a really big question. Vayitzav Adonai Elohim al ha'adam, and God commands Adam, saying, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel. From every tree of the garden, eat. Feel free to eat. And that word eat is a verb that's doubled. Mi eitz hadat tov v'ra lo tochel. And from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, don't eat. And it's so interesting that the word ra only comes into play in the narrative once human beings are created. Until now.
What's ra?
Oh, ra, evil or bad. Maybe bad is better than evil, but it's part of that point, counterpoint, good and bad. And in Genesis 1, and Rabbi David talked about this last night, all God saw was good. And now here's the possibility for bad, right? Here's the possibility of the other side of that polarity. Lo tochel mimenu ki biyom achlecha mimenu mot tamut. Because on that day that you eat of it, you will die, right? So something, you will die. Well, that's what it says literally. Or something will die. Or the you that you are now will die. Want to say anything about this? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I mean, this verse is just so it's so powerfully constructed. It's just like such beauty, and the economy of the language and the what's missing is also so it's so remarkable. Where did God took the man, Ha'adam, the man, placing him in the Gan Eden? It's like, what do you mean? Where did he take him from? He took him and placed him. Where was he that he had to take him and now place him? And also the placing here is really like Vayanichei, he placed him there, like, and then to work it, to watch over it, and then no sooner has God placed them there, and already said L'ovda u'l'shomra, which sounds like work. It's in order to. It's the verb to work the garden, and also to guard over it. Then God begins with the commandments. Like a lot of us are like that too. We put people in situations, then immediately put them there, and they have assumptions about what they're going to do, and then we start commanding them. So God commands them. I mean, there's a lot here. So, and also like the what's troubling from, I'm sure, for most of our readers is this invitation to not eat is really just a temptation in the most remarkable way. Just like, did you? I mean, why do we assume the myth is so powerfully constructed? Like, it's just so clearly mythical. I mean, it doesn't make any sense narratively unless it's just a mythical structure. Like, it's like telling somebody, whatever you do, don't look behind curtain. It's like, really?
Or a child, like you can play with all these toys except for this
one toy
in the middle of the room, right? In the very middle of the room.
It's hilarious.
It's hilarious. It's a complete setup.
It's a complete setup. It's so obviously set up, and also what you pointed out is so clear. The introduction of the word Ra here is it signals to the reader something really important is happening, and how eating itself. I mean, there's so much here that eating becomes the original sin is of course an oral sin, and that there is something what's oral here is also God's word. So they eat, but the real sin really is God's spoken word. They both sin. God says what came out of God's mouth is also a sin. What man or humanity puts into their mouth is a sin in whatever way we understand it. There's a lot going on here in a very beautiful mythic way that invites, as they'd say, midrash. It invites us to explore more deeply.
And I want to say a word about this use of myth, which is, it's a complicated word, but I often say, and people here know this, that this is a tale that human beings tell, at least I think, like, especially in this case, to understand what it means to be human.
Yes.
Right? It's like, how do we explain being human? So let's hold on to that. We're going to do a few more texts, and then we're going to start calling on some people.
And just apropos of what you and both you and Rabbi Anisfeld said, Conan Anisfeld said about trust. If this text is speaking to the theme of trust this year and what we're going to explore in a moment, it's pretty remarkable the use of command here and obligation as a way of signaling to Adam or humanity, whatever it is, that in order for God to trust that, God's essentially saying, I'm going to place you in the garden, make sure that you don't eat from this tree, right? And so is God trusting us by telling us, is God signaling God's lack of trust in us, or that the temptation will be too great? Is it useful for God to say, I know that you'll be tempted and I trust you, so I'm going to tell you what not to do? Like, those are some of the setups, right? In terms of trust. Like, this text is clearly signaling an ambivalence on the part of the divine character that is also mirrored maybe in our own ambivalence towards our own ability to comply and to withstand temptations, and especially what's complicated in a human being who has tremendous agency and free will. What happens to us the moment someone tells us not to do something?
Yeah. And animals are told to be fruitful and multiply earlier, but they're not commanded, right? This verb is very specific for human beings in the Torah.
Right, exactly. So in terms of God speaking, God will say what to do. Go ahead and be fruitful and multiply. That sounds like a command, and we often do that too. But here, explicitly, the verb to command is used, and that's why we underlined it and bolded it, so that you all would know. Vayetzav, it's a command. Okay, all right.
Okay, good.
Some more text.
All right, we're going to do a little more text, and we see two hands, and we're going to call on you in like 5 minutes. Okay, so then Genesis 2:25. So this is a fascinating juxtaposition of verses. You'll see in a second. Vayihiyu shnehem arumim, and the two of them were naked. Adam ve'ishto, Adam and his wife. And in the interim of these first two passages, Chava has been taken from the side, I will say, of the first human being. So now there's Adam and Adam's wife, or Chava. V'lo yitboshashu, and they were not embarrassed. They felt no shame, right? It was consciousness before shame. Something that I have to say, yearn for, like consciousness before self-consciousness. Like, what does that mean, right? Consciousness before self-consciousness. Okay, so then the very next verse, and these chapters are a later addition, so these don't think about these as separated in your mind. Very next verse is Genesis 3. V'hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh asher asa Adonai Elohim v'yomer El ha'isha af ki amar Elohim lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan. Oh my God, there's so much happening in this verse. Now the serpent was the shrewdest. So that word arum here is translated as shrewd. And it sounds very much like naked, arumim, but they're actually different words. Now, Everett Fox, the great biblical scholar and translator, translates these two as nude and shrewd. So you understand there's a word play going on in the Hebrew. Right here, you don't get it because the English doesn't help you with that. So the Nachash is shrewder or sneakier, snakier, right? From all the animals of the field that God had created or made. And so let's see, what does the snake say to the woman? Vayomer el ha'isha. Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from Eitz Hagan, from all the trees of the garden? And so what's really interesting about this is that you could see the snake is already casting doubt on God's word, right? Without hardly saying anything. Did God say that? Like, so now you begin to wonder, did God say that? All right. Vatomer ha'isha el ha'nachash mipri eitz hagan nochel. So now the snake has basically set up Eve so that she clarifies. So the woman says to the snake, no, from every tree of the garden we can eat. Umipri ha'etz asher b'toch hagan amar Elohim lo tochlu mamenu v'lo tig'u bo. But from the fruit of the tree that is in the center, in the middle of the garden, God said, or the Lord said, don't eat from it and don't touch it. Do you remember any touching in the first passage? Was there any touching, or there's only eating? So she adds touching, or Adam added touching. I'm not sure which.
She adds touching.
Right, but Adam could have. Well, we only have God's word up there, so Adam could have told her.
Right, in theory,
touch.
right.
Right. So I'm saying either
certainly God didn't.
He
say
added
it,
it, or she added it. God didn't say that.
Something was lost in the
Lest
telephone.
Lest you die. Vayomer hanachash el ha'isha lo mot temutun. The snake says to the woman, you're not going to die. And that verb is repeated, mot temutun, you're not going to die. Ki yodei Elohim ki biyom achalchem mimeno. Because God knows, right? The Lord knows on the day that you eat it, eat from that tree. V'nifkachu einechem, your eyes will be open. V'hayitem, and you will be like gods. V'hitim kelokim, yodei tov v'ra, knowing good and evil. You'll know that polarity. Right now, maybe you only know a singular dimension of consciousness, but you're going to move into a different kind of consciousness. And that might be a good place to stop and take a few comments. What do you think?
Sure. I just before we do just that, I think we're going to move quickly into the more conceptual reading here, which makes sense. But just in terms of wordplay, it's really beautiful. The construction is just it's remarkably beautiful. The word yodea, of course, is to know, and it's used in Eitz Hadas Tovara, to know, and V'adam yadad chava ishto, right? And there's something, yada here means intimate knowing, but it's used here the snake uses it, as it were, and it's employed by the snake. In other words, there's something that you know that God knows, that you don't know that God does know. But what God is trying to maintain is power over knowing. There's knowledge here that's at stake. And that knowledge is what's at a premium, and that the knowing, right? God knows that you'll know. You'll become knowers. Like you see the verb is used twice in verse 5. God knows that you will become like God, knowers, like to become known. All right. We know that, of course, this again, as Rabbi Kolrasa said, this mythic structure is not different than almost any other mythic structure of coming to knowledge, what in Hinduism is called, of course, the knowing of ignorance and avidya, and coming into the world of form and so on. We know that this myth plays with humanity's yearning for knowing and consciousness, right, to become fully conscious, and it's been mapped onto human development and so on. But this is such beautiful stuff here, and I do want to the sense that the snake is sneaky, and that nakedness. Right, there's an innocence of nakedness, and there's also innocence of nakedness that can be manipulated. Right, there's something about the snake being naked or sneaky and shrewd that can take advantage of the nude. This shrewd can manipulate the nude, and there's something about that wordplay in these two verses that are neighbors to one another, and they live in the same neighborhood. Right, it's one verse and then the next to say, like, your nakedness might be itself the precondition of having a snake take advantage of you,
Like being Tom.
Yeah, you're like
Right.
it's like they're naked, and so the naked snake who's not nude but shrewd takes advantage. And so there's something here about a loss of innocence, obviously, that is the precondition for this kind of inevitability almost. So anyway, we have lots of hands up. We'll take a couple of. Do you want to we'll just call on them in order?
Yeah, in order. And, I always say, I'll say it again, please be as concise as you can because we especially have a lot of hands today and we especially have a lot of material to get through today.
Which is hard, we know. So go ahead, Jay, and then Ilana and Roberta. So go ahead, Jay.
Quick comment and quick
You're
question.
live on Open Book. You're live on Open Book. Go ahead.
Live on Open Book. It's not Saturday night yet. Quick comment, quick question. The comment is like going back to the first text already with the tests. We go all the way to Akeda. Test. Come on already. Now the question I have, and Rob Angber may have given us a hint in terms of the sins that come out of God's mouth. Commonplace, we call it the tree of knowledge, but it's the tree of the knowledge of good, let's say, versus evil. Is that not the basis of morality? The basis of morality is being able to make that distinction. So is the original vision of of our universe immoral, that we cannot act as moral beings?
I would say it's pre-moral.
I think that, again, the question for us when we're reading these texts is, if to the best of our ability, what's God, the original intent, as it were, of the authors, or what are they trying to tell us and teach us in their own worldview on their own terms? And then the second question would be, how have we understood it over the last 2 millennia and change? So I think that on some level, the pre-moral universe is governed by a God who is not capricious, but whose commands are the definition, like Euthyphro in Plato had this really well. Like God's commands are themselves the definition of what one should and shouldn't do. And so in the pre-moral universe, God gives you a command: don't eat from the tree. You understand that to be like, okay, I won't eat from the tree, right? Even without your own internalized sense of right or wrong, if God says it in the author's mind, that's what's just and what's true. And to some extent, in a more prescriptive way, or I say that's a prescriptive one. In a more descriptive way, the Torah is saying, inevitably, human beings are born needing to become moral agents, and in order to do that, they're going to have to make choices.
But most immediately and literarily, what they know after they eat from the fruit of the tree is that they're naked, right? So that's interesting. They don't gain moral knowledge, not immediately in the story.
Well, they know that they do, right. They don't gain moral knowledge, but they gain the knowledge of having rebelled against God's word, right? Because that's clear in terms of the consequences. All of a sudden they say, oh, wait a second, we're separate. We're separate beings, and we have the ability to defy an order given on some level. We have the ability to kind of go against our sort of own will. And that becomes the birth of consciousness, the birth of separateness, the birth of almost like oppositional bonding in the child, where the child says no, and that's an innate way for the child to separate and become their own self, and that's happening here. But right, yeah.
Okay, let's go on.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jay. I don't know. That's like a whole course right there.
You're
But that's
right, it's a
great.
whole course.
Okay, Ilana.
Hi, good morning, Shabbat Shalom. It's so nice to be with you all. I was thinking, this sort of resonated for me. I've recently joined a new group where I'm a member of a decision-making body. And some of this has sort of come up for me yesterday and in the last couple of months around what does it mean not to listen to something that is commanded by the person in an authority role? And what does it mean to ask questions? And I was sort of in what you were just saying around, can you have that separation and still come back together and sort of defy a command or defy something and it not be seen as undermining, but like in this narrative that I feel like we're sort of weaving, it's human beings becoming conscious and human beings stepping into their own place and being separate from God and being this, once you create, right, you let go of what's there, you can't control it anymore. And then it becomes something else that inevitably changes the relationship. And that's something that can be beautiful, even though it might bring in bad or some other dimension. And I mean, I'm sort of curious about like what God's reaction is and thinking about like, well, what does it mean to the person who's been defied or not listen to? And how do you kind of be with that? Like, I mean, I know as a parent, I find it was very challenging for me as my children defied, and it's still the beginning stages of it, of like, you're not listening to me. I'm the one in charge. Like, it's a very challenging situation, but how do you allow for that? Like, that's part of a process, and that leads to actually something much more whole, and much like with the division or with the binary, you get more complexity.
Yeah, I think there's something, of course, one can read God's response to this, or what's called the fall in Christian literature. Like what exactly is the sin here? And obviously the sin to some extent is not having listened to God, complying with God's will or whatever God's expressed will was. But I guess hovering above this entire conversation is whether descriptive or prescriptive. Is this inevitable, and is it natural, and is it itself good? Is the movement into rebellion and into agency inevitable and therefore kind of pre-programmed? And again, in the descriptive way of this story, it's part of God's plan that we have our own will, and that and God's willing to take a risk. To quote Adele, God's willing to take a risk on us, and that's a good thing. And whether or not God's a good parent in putting up with our rebellions is another theologically thorny question. But certainly, I trust that you're a better parent in many ways than the God of the Bible, the God of Torah
Right, but
sometimes
Alana,
claims.
you're also saying something like you're having compassion for the God figure, because
Right.
it is hard to be disobeyed. It's very threatening, right?
Sure.
I mean, I've been sitting with that for like the last 22 years. It's hard, right? And how do you stay, like you said, the challenge is to maintain that connection.
Right. It's not just parental too. It's obviously, if you look at the work of early 20th century psychoanalytic work, and people who actually looked at fascism, like the totalitarian state, and how we look at rebellion and the will of the people and the voice of the people. I mean, there are a lot of these very fundamental questions in terms of the various relationships and how they show up in terms of rebellion and compliance, and how we invite relationship, and how we invite the use of power. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about now, is power, and whether or not is there a healthy way to be with people who assert their own power when we have power. And so those are obviously thorny questions, and the more we talk, the more hands go up, and the less time we'll have to.
Exactly.
So we're going to go to
I want to name a command that's sort of hitting me right now, which is the command to get to the next text. And
all right,
yeah,
so
and do what we planned. Let's do
one more, and
one more. Okay.
One more, and then we'll go. Okay,
Okay.
Roberta, go ahead, and keep your hands up so we can come back to you guys too. Okay.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, well, I just have a question that is a whole new course, right? What is going on that like when
What's going
Rabbi,
on?
right? What's going on? Like Rabbi Diane, when you started saying how there's Tov. Here's this God that's seeing it's only Tov, and then there's this switch. Well, there's a switch in God, right? So Tov is Elohim. Elohim, Rak Elohim. Then it's Yud-He Vav-He Elohim. And that's when it all falls apart. So comment, please.
Well, Yud Hey Vav Hey, you're saying
The name of so with the second creation story, this is the second creation story of Earthling and the snake and everything. When it's all falling apart, it's a new name for God. Something's happened. So
yeah, that's interesting, because God created human beings, and there's this shift in God's nature.
well, the first creation,
In the
it's
chapter, right?
and it's just Elohim, and it's all Tov. And then Genesis 2:4. This is the chronicle, and on this day, now all of a sudden, it's the first time I think in Torah we see Yud He Vav He Elohim. So
Well,
Yeah, that's a profound question.
so if you look at the story, in first of all, it's not all Tov. In this first chapter, there's when humanity is created, it's not Tov. There's no tov used to refer to human beings, but the totality of it is called tov ma'od.
There's no ra either.
There's no ra, but there's tov ma'od, and the inclusion of human beings who show up on the scene have within them in the first chapter the potential for lo tov, right? The thing that is, and in fact, in chapter 2, when God creates, when woman, as it were, is created, it's lo tov. It's actually lo tov. It's not good,
Lihiyot adam levado.
right? To be alone, and so there's a really fundamental understanding that to some extent, when God looks at the creation as a whole, it's tov ma'od. When God looks at individual elements of the creation story, it's
Nice.
tov. But when humanity is created, there's the potential there that signals great moral possibility, which is Yud Hey Vav Hey, and also great moral depravity, which is also Yud Hey Vav Hey. The totality, the whole catastrophe is there. And so humanity is both natural and supernatural, and maybe sometimes unhealthily, potentially can bring Ra into the world in the sense of chosen evil, not naturally predisposed. So I think that's what's happening there. And that really signals Yud Hey Vav Hey, because the totality of that is that we can be like Yud Hey Vav Hey, transcendent, sublime, and also not.
Like you said, a whole course. There's a lot more to say.
Yeah,
about this.
let's go.
Okay,
It's a
we're gonna go
beautiful
back
question.
into
Let's
the.
go
We're gonna
back.
come back to you all. See your hands raised, and I'm gonna just do a couple more minutes of this text. And I think we're gonna go into the cook text. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. So what happens here is, let's screen share. Oh, we are screen sharing. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we're on. Oops. Okay, so we're on. I think we're a little. Yeah. All right, so we're on verse 5. No, we did that already, right? Oops.
Which is
We're
happening.
on 6. But Terei, okay, so this is really fascinating because look who's really takes leadership here. So it's Vav, 6. But Terei ha'isha ki tov ha'etz l'machal v'chi ta'avahu l'einayim. So the woman sees that the tree is good for eating and that it's desirous for the eyes. V'nechmad ha'etz l'haskil, and it's like wondrous for knowing or understanding. But tikach mipriyo, and the woman takes from its fruit. But tochal, and she eats. Now, watch carefully. But titen, and she gives. Vatiten gam leisha ima vayochal, and she gives it also to her husband who was with her, and he eats. So it seems like he's standing there the whole time. He was with her. He's standing there. That's like a little word that's not even translated. Put an ellipsis there so you'd know. He's standing there passively. He's not saying no. The snake is wrong. He's not doing anything. She has this whole sort of thought process that gets her to eat from the tree, right? It's like for this and for this and for this and for this, and he eats. And it's interesting. She wants a source of wisdom, right? She's after that. So is what she did, like, I wonder, is what she did wrong? Is it right? Hard to tell. Is it immoral? Is it amoral? But tipachna einei shnehem, and the eyes of both of them were opened. And what did they know? Vayid'u ki eru mimhem, and they knew that they were naked.
Or shrewd.
Or shrewd. Vayitparu alei te'ena v'yasu lahem chagorot. And they took fig leaves and they sewed them into kind of little skirts. Vayishma'u et kol Adonai, 8 now. Vayishma'u et kol Adonai Elohim mitalech began leruach hayom. And they heard the voice of God walking around, so intimate, right? Reflexive verb for walking. Began leruach hayom, in the breezy time of the day, or the wind or the spirit of the day. Vayitchabei Adam v'ishto, and Adam and his wife hid mipnei Adonai Elohim, from the Lord their God, bitoch eitz hagan, in the midst of the trees of the garden. Vayikra Adonai Elohim el Adam, and God called to Adam, Vayomer lo Ayeka. And God said to him, where are you? And Adam said, Vayomer et kolcha shamati began. And Adam said, I heard your voice in the garden. Va'ira, and I was afraid. Ki erom anochi ve'echa veh. Because I am naked and I hid. Right? So that's so interesting. And I was talking to my chavrita this morning, as you know I always do, Sharon, and we talked about it, and she said, like, confessing that you're hiding feels even more intimate and in a way even more present than saying hineni, like I am here, right? It's like, wow, so embarrassing to explain to somebody I was hiding from you. So I think we'll leave it there. I think we have enough material to go to the cook. Yeah, we just touched the big themes.
Yeah, I think maybe can you just do just one? Let's just do 11 because
Sure.
I mean, verse 12 is going to be about Adam blames his wife, and that's always like the first thing is he always blames somebody else, right?
Yes.
But like this question from God is really this interrogation, and of all the things, right? Like, because Adam doesn't say that he ate, right? He doesn't admit that he ate. He just says that I'm hiding because I'm scared.
Yeah.
He doesn't really admit the thing that he shouldn't have done, but he says, I'm afraid of you because I'm naked.
Yeah, he almost confesses that he's naked.
He confesses that he's naked. He says, "Va'iraki erom anochi." So the thing that God picks up on, of course, and
I'm exposed, I'm defenseless.
exactly, and God says, "Mi higidlecha ki erom ata." Who told you?
Yeah.
Which is also remarkable. Like mi higidlecha. Who could possibly have told you that you were? Obviously, it's a rhetorical question from God. Like God knows, right? We assume, or maybe we shouldn't assume that, but God says, "Did you eat?" Right? He gives him an out. Of course, he doesn't say you did eat. He said, "Did you eat from the tree that I commanded you?" The second time the word "command" appears, he says not that I told you, but that I commanded you to not eat from. Did you eat? It's also a very strange locution. Did you eat from the thing I told you not to eat from? And it's just like the thing that gets caught in God's craw is the word erom. Right? God cannot get and the text is wanting us to return over and over and over again to this erom, wordplay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we do the text from Rav Kook
let's
and
do
then
Rav
open it
Kook.
up? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we still see a lot of hands, and we're gonna try our best to get back to all of them if we can. The next text is a text that once I read this text a number of years ago, and I never lost touch with it. It kind of stayed with me forever. Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of pre-mandate Palestine, born in 1865 and died in 1935. Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, prolific author. We've studied Rav Kook before in the shul, and it would behoove us at one point to have like a year-long study of Rav Kook and just, Gershom Scholem, the greatest academic researcher of Kabbalah, said that the only real original mysticism of the entire 20th century came through this man, Rav Kook, who was basically owned by everybody in the Jewish world, whether you're ultra-Orthodox to the right, you're religious Zionist, secularist, love Rav Kook. Rav Kook is, essentially owned by everyone. He was that big a person. And so he's also quite well known for his desire to write in a literary style that also aped some of what was going on in the late 19th century literary circles of Europe and also in Israel and Palestine. So this piece, where he quotes the first verse in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel the prophet locates himself in the midst of the exile. Ezekiel the prophet Yechezkel is in Babylonia, and he locates himself there. And this geographical location for the prophet Ezekiel becomes a launch pad for Rav Kook to speak eloquently and passionately about another kind of exile, not a geographic one, but an existential one. And so Rav Kook writes, V'ani betoch hagolah. He writes, Ezekiel said that I, betoch hagolah, I mean, I was in the midst of the Golah, of the exile, which, by the way, is also reminiscent of betoch hagan. Like that appears twice, right, in that text that we studied, betoch hagan, in the midst of the exile. He writes, ha'ani ha'pnimi, ha'atzmi, the essential inner I, Ani, he calls it Pnimi, the inner eye, Ha'atzmi, that is essential. Shalei Achid v'Shel HaTzibor, whether it's of the individual or of the collective. Eino mitgale b'toch hiyuto rak lefi erech ha'kedusha v'tara shelo. It appears only according to the relationship of holiness and purity of that entity, right? Lefi erech ha'gvura ha'elyonah, he starts to now wax poetically according to the value of its supernal gevura, its strength, its courage. Hasfuga me'ora Torah shel ziv ma'ala, that is itself suffused, the word safug, like the sponge, it's suffused from the light of holiness, of the radiance of above ma'ala. Shehim lahevet b'kirbo, that is burning within, right? Their purity. Chatanu imavotenu, as when he quotes Psalms 106, we and our forefathers sinned. Now this comes to our text very beautifully. The sin of the first human, right? This missing of the mark was shenit naker, that he became alienated. They became alienated la'atzmiuto, from their essence. Shepana l'da'ato shel nachash, turning away to the da'at here. He uses that very, like very deeply, to the knowledge of the snake, the da'at of the snake. V'ibed et atzmo, and lost himself. V'lo yada l'ashiv, didn't know how to answer a clear question to the question ayeka. It's a typo. To the question when God said ayeka, right? Where are you? Couldn't return an answer. He didn't know they didn't know who he was. He couldn't say where he was. He didn't know his inner place, his inner point. Who are you? It's like, where are you? Is who are you? And when you don't know who you are, you can't say where you are. Because the aniyut here, it's really powerful because he's making up a word. Aniyut means the I-ness, which can also sound like aniyut, which can be the opposite of that, is like aniyut means poverty, the impoverished eye. But here it's the aniyut ha'amitit ne'ebdam menu, his inner truthful eye was lost. Because he bowed to a foreign god. That it really should say Zanu, I don't know why. Zanu acharei Elokei nechar, they went after foreign gods. That we as a people do the same thing. Peoples can become alienated from themselves. We can lose our way. We can lose our way by bowing and prostrating ourselves before those gods that are foreign to our inner character. And then he goes on to talk about chata aretz, right? That the land can also sin, right? This is a midrashic connection to when God asked the land to bring forth fruit and didn't. So, but meaning the land loses its character. He's using mythic language to talk about becoming alienated from yourself and not producing what you are here to produce. You walk in other people's light. The Midrash says that when God asked the tree to bring forth fruit, and to bring the fruit that would taste like the tree's bark, like the entire tree would taste with one taste, instead the tree brought forth a separate taste, right? And that becomes for Rav Kook an explanation of how means and ends sometimes don't meet, right? And that's a messianic vision. But he was hoping that would have been the truth in the garden. So there's a lot here. Let's go to this part. He says this part right here, and let's find it in English.
I think this part is also important. Like looking outside yourself to like.
Kaririot.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. He connects it to almost all of these moments of alienation in the natural world, in the mythic natural world. The moon, right? This is important. The moon and the sun were originally, quote unquote, the same size in the creation story in chapter 1, and then the moon made herself smaller. The moon, whatever, there's the story that the moon made itself smaller. He says the sin of the moon is that the moon looked, avda sivuv pnimuta, simchat chelka. The moon was jealous of the sun, saying, I want to be like the sun. Chalma al dvar hadarat, melachim chitzona. וכך הולך העולם וצולל באבדן העני של כל אחד, של הפרווה של הכלל. And he says, like, just like the moon lost her own lunar qualities and said, I want to be solar, and lost herself, that's called, when we lose ourselves, that's called losing your eye, right? And then he says in educational spheres. This is like, I think this is why I remembered it, because this very much related to me in my life. He said, Ba'im mechanchim milumadim. Come these really great educators. And mistaklim yichitzoniyut, and they look at the externals. They measure things. They quantify misichim de'agam heimin ani, and they lose the I, the individual, the uniqueness of each student. Mosifim teven al medura. They throw grain onto the fire. They throw mashkim et atzmeim bechometz. They give those who are thirsty vinegar. Right? They fatten the minds and all of these things with knowledge and externalities that are, that's external to them. And the I is forgotten. And this is a great line, and then we'll open it up. He's clearly in dialogue here with Buber, right? In dialogue with the great dialogical philosopher. If there's no I, there can't be a who. There isn't a third person either. And the kal v'chomer, even more so, she'ein ata. There is no thou. There's no you. Forget about I, thou, Buber. If there's no I, if we live in a world where people have forgotten the I, then there can't really be relationship. Ruach apeinu Mashiach Adonai, the breath of our souls is the Messiah. And it's not something michutz lanu. It's not something outside of us. It's something within us. And so essentially Rav Kook writes that the great alienation that was being described in that chapter, the alienation of knowing, is the great knowing, he says, which we've lost, right? Is that it wasn't the sin of eating from the tree. It was the sin of listening to the voice that alienated us from and that alienates us from our deeper self. Okay.
I want to say one thing about that. I realized in reading this in advance that the people I get angriest at are those people to whom I respond to by abandoning myself. So what I'm upset about in the end is abandoning myself.
Wow.
And he's right.
That's a deep insight. No, it really is.
I'm glad you think
That's
so.
a very deep insight. That's
Very
almost like
deep.
It's like it's your fault. But no, in the end, I abandoned myself in response to what they were doing because it touched some deep, painful, broken, tortured place.
Well, okay, so we have less than 12 minutes because I have to take the computer and go inside. We're going to move through, and people will be respectful of other people by doing some simsum on what they like to share. So Nehemiah, go
Big
ahead.
Simpson.
Big simsum.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Big challenge, so much, and focus on one point. Okay, just mention, Franz Kafka, the great Kabbalist, said, the missing point was that not that they didn't take from the tree of knowledge, they didn't take from the tree of life that was allowed to them. Everything would have looked different if they did. I'll leave this alone. The snake is my focus today. Anachash. Solomon, the wisest person of all, said, I have all the wisdom, but three things I can't understand. The way of snake on the stone, the way of Nesher of the eagle in the sky, and the way of man and woman. I understood always man and woman. I still don't understand the eagle, but now I understand the snake. I had light. The snake is so smart. It can even not just the innocent, even the smartest people of like Solomon can be tricked through brainwash or whatever by the snake. I was tricked by a snake when I was a young man, a man who pretended to be my friend, conman, and got me out of all the money I had. Since then, I became an expert in catching snakes, conman. I caught the conman who did trick all of us to believe there's no pollution in 9/11 and after 9/11, even though it was so obvious to everybody who smelled was there. And the snake included the head of the EPA, on the press, and Sanjay Gupta. All of them lied to us. I finish with this.
Yes.
There are snakes all around us, and we have to be very wise, because the more the things get worse, snakes know how to manipulate and brainwash. That's all. Snakes are smarter than even trick the wisest of all, like Solomon. Thank you. Ibati.
Next. Shamati.
Shamanu. Jay, thank you for waiting. Go ahead. I'm sorry, not Jay. Stuart. Go ahead, Stuart.
Shabbat Shalom. One thing that struck me this morning when reading this is the introduction of the fruit of the pri. When God commanded Adam, God uses the phrase mi'etz. The snake uses the phrase mi'etz. It's only until Isha comes that we have the pri that is introduced, and then that again falls away in the further conversation, that the Isha is the only one that uses the fruit, pri. And that kind of reflects something that you use in Rav Kook, where he talks about the taste of the fruit versus the taste of the tree. It just struck me that Isha is the only one that mentions the pri here in this entire story.
Amazing. Have to look at that. That's really a good insight. Thank you. We're gonna take a
Well,
look
she
at
also produces the fruit of the womb, so that's also interesting.
that. No, interesting.
don't
Okay,
know, yeah.
that's a precursor to the pre that we
It's a
have to pre. We love it.
precursor.
We have more to work on. Thank you, my friend. David Kurtz, go ahead.
This Bereshit has the one of the most interesting quotes to me that supersedes almost the whole Torah, and it's that man and God said, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness." So I'm interested in what you think of what that means and what is going on. And the other thing is, and I think it kind of ties in a weird way, is in truth, the snake told the truth. The snake said, "You are not going to die, and you will get knowledge like divine beings." So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
The image of God thing is so big and so deep. I don't even know where to begin.
What, that's something?
Yeah. I think the fact of knowing that we're in the image of God, like just